My name's Lyn Adamson, and I'm a member of the Board of Science for Peace. I'm also co-chair of Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and a longtime peace activist. And I'm pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Maria Stephan this afternoon and our topic of nonviolent organizing, nonviolent change. How can we do this in a good way? So we'll give that you a better introduction in a minute, Maria, but we generally do start with a land acknowledgement. And I'd also like to credit the Nonviolent Working Group of Science for Peace for doing the organizing for our event today. And just so folks understand our program for today, we're just on for the hour. We'll be closing at 6, and we will do an introduction, a land acknowledgement. We'll introduce Maria. She will speak for 10-15 minutes or so, and then there'll be a bit of discussion between two of our board members, who I'll introduce at the time. And then we'll be open for audience question and discussion. And I will let you know that Maria is interested in what context we're dealing with here in Canada, what our concerns are. So as she speaks and the discussion takes place with Arnd and Ellie from the board, think about your questions and how this might apply, or how we might learn something that's useful for our work here in Canada. So for the land acknowledgement, I'm just going to share a story because the Wet'suwet'en, as many people here will know, have been fighting the CGL pipeline across their territory in BC for many years now. And CGL is now drilling under the river that they've been working so hard to protect as land defenders. And I had the opportunity to meet Slado, who's leading the land defense and the water defense there with the Wet'suwet'en. And she had a comment that I wanted to share with folks. She says, people sometimes call me an activist. She said, I'm not an activist. I'm a Wet'suwet'en woman, and I have responsibilities. And I took that really to heart. And I'm a Quaker, maybe people here may know. And so I think I'm a Quaker woman and I have responsibilities. I'm a grandmother and I have responsibilities. So one of the things that we learned so well from Indigenous communities is the value of thinking ahead 7 generations, thinking ahead to the world that we're leaving for our children. So I want to just recognize that we are all on land that was and is Indigenous land, and to remember our relationship, to value that relationship, to do the work of reconciliation and justice building, to support the land defenders and water defenders, and work together to keep a living world for the next generation. So I just wanted to share that personal story as a land acknowledgement for today. So thanks, everybody. If you want to speak, by the way, later on when there's an opportunity to speak, you can raise your hand by using the reaction button, and or you can raise your hand and wave at me. I'll probably see you, but the reaction button is good. And the chat will be open, so that if you have a comment or question you want to put in the chat, feel free to do that as well. So now I'll just introduce Maria, give you a little bit of background here. So Maria Stephan is an award-winning author and organizer whose work in academic, public service, and nonprofit sectors had focused on the role of nonviolent action and peace building, advancing human rights, democracy, and sustainable peace in the U.S., and globally. As chief organizer, Maria provides strategic direction and thought leadership within Horizons, which I hope you'll tell us more about, brokering key relationships, bridging research and practice, and convening partnerships for collective action. Maria has dedicated her life to the proposition that ordinary people, when organized and inspired, can bring about extraordinary change. Her peacebuilding work in Afghanistan and with Syrian activists in Turkey has received 2 meritorious service awards. She directed policy and educational initiatives at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict and has taught graduate and undergraduate courses on civil resistance and human rights at Georgetown University and American University. She's a co-author with Erica Chenoweth of Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict. And This was an award-winning book. You may, and I think many people here are familiar with the work. And she's written other books and also co-edited books having to do with the themes that we're looking at today. She's co-editor of Is Authoritarianism Staging a Comeback? And Civilian Jihad, Nonviolent Struggle, Democratization and Governance in the Middle East. She has directed the program on nonviolent action at the U.S. Institute of Peace, overseeing global programming, research, and policy, and working with peace builders and social movements and struggles to advance more just, peaceful, and democratic societies before going to the Horizons Project. I'm just going to come back to that one statement, Maria, that ordinary people, when organized and inspired, can bring about extraordinary change. That is a very inspiring thought. And with that, let's hand the floor to you. Thank you for joining us today, and please go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Lyn, and thanks, Richard. And thanks to the Science for Peace group and the Nonviolence working group for inviting me to speak with you all this evening. I was sharing before we all got on the call that this is the day before the midterm elections here in the United States. So lots of concern about what the future holds for democracy in my country. And, you know, there's a big looming question about, you know, whether or not the US will continue down the path of an egalitarian, multiracial, pluralistic democracy or not. And so I was very curious to hear what the situation was like in Canada and kind of how potent the far right movement is, because there's undoubtedly a lot of overlap in our situations. And certainly, as we know, this rise of authoritarianism is global. It's affecting people in lots of different countries, including my own. And so I think what I've been invited to speak with you all about is not only kind of observations related to the rise of authoritarianism and the backsliding of democracy, but also what my research and kind of personal experience working with many pro-democracy movements in the US and globally has led me to conclude is the most powerful antidote to authoritarianism, which is broad-based nonviolent movements. And so wanted to talk with you a little bit about kind of trends that we're seeing in the civil resistance space, including some very worrisome trends in about the efficacy of nonviolent movements, and maybe reflect on how that can influence how we think about our own organizing work. So Lyn mentioned that I'm co-leading the Horizons Project. So the Horizons Project is a small initiative. We're a small team of 5 based in various different states here in the US. And we're really focused on strengthening US democracy and countering the authoritarian threats in the country. And so the approach that we're taking is an organizing one. So we're very focused on strengthening relationships, communication, collaboration between the social justice, bridge building, and democracy communities in the US. So really bringing to bear different perspectives, different tools, different approaches, recognizing that we need all hands on deck in this moment. We need strategies grounded in dialogue. We need strategies grounded in civil resistance and direct action. We need power building. We need peace building and bridge building, kind of how to bring these various approaches and communities together is at the heart of our work. And we're very seized with kind of the state of US democracy, the very clear kind of attacks on democracy that certainly predate the Trump administration, but were absolutely accelerated during the Trump years. You know, and I can talk a little bit more about that, but a lot of our work involves organizing, involves bringing to bear some of the research on how to build effective pro-democracy movements and how to build united fronts, which again have played a really key role in other backsliding democracies to kind of, you know, amass an effective movement. And so, you know, I felt particularly compelled to focus more on the US after spending most of the past 2 decades very focused internationally. So as Lyn noted, I spent time first at a nonprofit, the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, working with activists, organizers, movement leaders in different countries around the world, including in some of the most repressive countries around the world. I was also in the State Department and spent a year and a half in Kabul, Afghanistan, and then a year working with the Syrian opposition from Turkey. And then was also at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where I directed the program on nonviolent action. And it was kind of between my work at ICNC and at the State Department when I met Erica Chenoweth. So Erica and I met at an academic conference in Colorado that was focused on people power and like how to teach about people power and nonviolent action. And so Erica and I, we were incidentally roommates during that gathering, and we were having deep discussions late into the night about, oh, you guys keep talking about all these effective nonviolent campaigns in India and South Africa and Chile and, the US civil rights movement in Poland, but how effective can nonviolent resistance really be against the most formidable opponents? And what has its track record been? So it was at that moment that we decided to join forces and collect data on the hundreds of different major nonviolent and violent campaigns over the past century. And that culminated in the book, Why Civil Resistance Works. I was actually working at the State Department in our embassy in Kabul while we were writing that book together. So Erica was in California, I was in Kabul. So it was a kind of strange environment to be writing about the strategic efficacy of nonviolent resistance. But anyway, so that, has been a lot of my work, focusing on authoritarianism, focusing on the efficacy of nonviolent resistance. But I really felt a call to focus more on the United States, just given everything that I knew about how authoritarianism works, how the authoritarian playbook is used, was playing out in my own backyard. And so that was like the call to really focus on horizons and start something with a few other colleagues. So that's the work that I'm doing now, but it also, we really are intentional in wanting to make connections between organizers, activists in the US and those in other countries, including those that are experiencing backsliding democracy. So that sort of the global democratic solidarity is at the heart of the work and the organizing that we're doing with Horizons. So that's a little bit about that. And just to share kind of, what we're seeing in terms of the rise of authoritarianism globally. Some of you may be familiar with the global democracy watchdog Freedom House. Freedom House puts out its annual Freedom in the World report. And this current year's Freedom in the World report found that we are entering 16 consecutive years of decline in democratic freedoms. So right now, 38% of the global population lives in not free countries. Only 20% lives in free countries, which is certainly not conducive to building a more peaceful world. Another international democracy organization, the International Idea Group, based in Stockholm, Sweden, officially classified the United States as a backsliding democracy last year, certainly following the January 6th attack on the Capitol and the attempt to overturn the results of the last election, but lots of other trends. So the US is now technically a backsliding democracy. And, I think we don't have time to go into all the causes of rising authoritarianism, and you're seeing in Canada the rise of the far right and far right extremism. But I think if we, can look at some of the macro causes, they would have to be the growing concentration of wealth and power in fewer hands. We're seeing a politicization of identities. There's a very powerful us versus them narrative that is taking root in backsliding democracies. There's a very rapid spread of mis and disinformation, the spread of conspiracy theories, lies, and the like. We're seeing, and I think this maybe has to do with the increasing use of social media and different social media platforms, but there's a lot of loneliness and alienation out in the world. And one of my philosopher heroes, Hannah Arendt, when she was writing about totalitarianism in the 20th century, was really focusing on how totalitarian leaders prey on loneliness, alienation, a sense of disorientation. And I think that's really omnipresent in the world today. And then, there's been a lot of authoritarian learning that's taking place. And I'll say a few words about that in the context of declining efficacy of nonviolent resistance. But authoritarian regimes around the world are learning how to do repression more effectively, more smartly, if you will. There's a lot of fora for leaders to learn from each other. And I think authoritarian learning is maybe happening at a more rapid and kind of efficient way than some of the learning between nonviolent movements and pro-democratic movements. So, and you all probably are very familiar with the authoritarian playbook. I would say it's been now translated into dozens of languages around the world, but like basic components of the authoritarian playbook: divide and conquer, reject democratic rules of the game, deny the legitimacy of opponents, use legal or pseudo-legal practices to gut institutions and weaken the opposition, undermine the public's belief in truth, demonize opponents and unfriendly media, blame minorities and immigrants for a country's problems, pay off supporters and punish defectors, encourage or condone violence, which is very prevalent in the United States right now, indicate a willingness to curtail certain civil liberties like freedom of protest, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and make people feel like they're powerless to affect change. So like these are classic attributes, and I'd be curious how this list resonates with what you all are observing and experiencing in Canada now. But certainly this is very present in the United States, where I was just reading statistics yesterday, something like 300 members of the Republican Party that are currently running for federal office and state offices. So like governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, like close to 300 GOP members deny the legitimacy of the 2020 election. So they fully embrace the big lie that the last election was stolen. They're running on it. It's not a fringe position. It's a mainstream position now in the Republican Party. Meanwhile, you have close to 35 states in the United States that have imposed draconian anti-protester bills, with the most draconian being in Florida. So now, like, so if somebody drives a car into you while you're protesting in Florida, they are not held criminally accountable. Whereas if you're at a protest where property damage occurs, you can be held liable. So very strict anti-protester bills are in place. There's a whole effort to ban books in the United States. And like, if that's not worrisome, I don't know what is. So a lot of books focusing on issues of race, LGBTQ issues are now being banned in libraries across the US. You all remember the images in Charlottesville after the 2016 election of the white supremacists, like kind of marching down the streets. I'd say this is no longer fringe. Again, like the far right white supremacist groups have very much entered the political mainstream and are being embraced by many members of the current GOP. And you also have our news station. So Fox News and Tucker Carlson are meeting with Viktor Orban in Hungary. So they're having kind of meetings about what to say about immigrants and all this. So you have all these various kind of variables playing out in the US. And I'm, again, curious how this resonates in Canada. At the same time, I still fundamentally believe that the most powerful antidote to rising authoritarianism, to the takeover of major political parties by extremist authoritarian factions, is broad-based nonviolent movements that bring people together across divides, including deep divides, that engages in acts of nonviolent resistance. So, this is the Nonviolence Working Group, but just to clarify, when I'm talking about nonviolent resistance or civil resistance, I'm referring to a methodology of waging struggle that involves the use of nonviolent direct action tactics, so protest, sit-ins, strikes, boycotts, stayaways, the full range that's used to shift power in conflict without the threat or use of violence. And so, historically, you all, Lyn was mentioning the research with Erica Chenoweth and why civil resistance works. We have found that nonviolent resistance has historically been twice as effective as violence in advancing major political goals like like challenging authoritarian regimes. At the same time, some of you may be aware that over the past decade, there has been a precipitous drop in the overall effectiveness of nonviolent campaigns. So right now, the success rate for major nonviolent campaigns globally is something like 35%, which is about the lowest it's been certainly in decades. So that raises the natural question, why? What's happening? And so, you know, maybe worth sharing too, what the research found to be kind of the attributes of successful campaigns, just to put them out there. So we found that campaigns that attracted large and diverse participation, so people, men, women, young, old, from diverse sectors of society, movements that had increasingly large and diverse participation tended to be more successful. Campaigns that innovated tactically, so they didn't just rely on street protest demonstrations, they also engaged acts of non-cooperation, which tend to be very powerful in civil resistance, so strikes, boycotts, sit-ins, stayaways, you know, those types of tactics. Campaigns that were able to maintain nonviolent discipline, so that had codes of conduct, that had marshals, that had training. You know, this tends to be a lost art. We forget that you need to be prepared, to train, to organize. And some of that aspect has, I think, been lost as we've really focused on more fast social media, quick mobilization, if you will. But anyway, nonviolent discipline, defections in key pillars of support. So when the unusual suspects, like, you know, the white collar folks, the professionals, you know, people who aren't supposed to be protesting, let's say, when they stop going along with the status quo, when they withhold consent and cooperation, when they protest, boycott, it tends to matter a lot. So when you see defections in bureaucracies, in unions, in professional syndicates, you know, in religious institutions, in corporations, that is a sign that a movement is gaining success and power. And that maybe has to do with what we were discussing earlier about the climate change movement. Where are we seeing defections? What can bring about more defections? That kind of thing. And then, you know, the ability of movements to maintain resilience in the face of repression is really key. And this is where organizing is as important, if not more important, than mobilization and going out into the streets. So the ability to organize. So I think, you know, hopefully that can tee up a conversation that, you know, there's no reason to think that violence is more effective now, but it is worrisome that nonviolent resistance has kind of dipped as much as it has in overall efficacy. And I think that begs the question of not only why, because I think, you know, some of the answers, authoritarian learning, smart repression, those are certainly important variables, but I think within movements themselves, and Erica Chenoweth has also done a lot of good writing about this as well, within movements themselves, there's kind of been a de-emphasis often on training, on preparation, on organizing, on nonviolent discipline, all of which I would say is critically important now as we deal with kind of this onslaught of lots of different crises, from authoritarianism, climate change, inequality. So maybe I'll leave it at that. I know you mentioned that folks would have some questions and want to discuss. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for starting us off there. And wonderful what you shared with us, much appreciated. I'm now going to open the conversation to two respondents who will have questions for you. They're both members of Science for Peace Board of Directors. Arnd Jurgensen teaches international relations at U of T, and Ellie Kirzner is, I think, retired journalist, a senior editor with Now Magazine here in Toronto, and they're both active in our nonviolent working groups. So Ellie, would you like to start with a question?
Yes, I could. Thank you so much, Maria. That was exceedingly broad and exceedingly deep. So it's hard to know where to start. I don't know whether to start on the rise of the right in Canada or on nonviolent theory, but I'd like to start here. I think I'm just following my interest, if you don't mind, taking off from the things you've written and said. You said, you asked the question once, what if a right to assist nonviolent pro-democracy actors replace the responsibility to protect as the guiding principle for a new global order. And you have written in the past a great deal about the necessity of assisting democracy movements abroad in terms of building resilience and organizing in the development of nonviolent techniques and methods. And I just like to just pose two questions coming out of that. First of all, this is not my point of view, but many on the left are concerned when people talk about foreign actors intervening in local democracy struggles. And I wonder if you could offer some response to that. And secondly, and I know it's a subtle point, and you've done a paper on when foreign intervention, non-lethal foreign intervention is helpful and where it isn't. So I know you've worked out the subtleties of that. But I wonder if you could just answer the general question of how we respond to questions about Western interference in other cultures. And the second thing is, yeah, maybe I'll just leave that there. Could I just sit with that?
Yeah, sure. Well, if I had known that this was going to be more of an interest, I would have framed more around that book. So the last book that Erica Chenoweth and I wrote together was on the role of external actors in influencing the trajectories and outcomes of major nonviolent campaigns. So, and if I'm not super good at multitasking, but if somebody Googles that, an ICNC monograph, you can put the link in the chat. You're able to download it for free. We did that intentionally and didn't go the like formal book publishing route so that it'd be like readily accessible to a lot of people. So yes, we did a whole like 3+ year study that looked at, again, had thousands of different observations of major nonviolent campaigns and looked at the roles played by governments, non-governmental actors, multilateral institutions, transnational solidarity actors, religious groups, like a full like range of external actors. And the questions we were asking for that study were, what was the role that these actors played both in the lead up to the mass protest, during the period of mass protest, and in the year, like 2 years following the mass protest. And the bottom line is that it's definitely a mixed bag. Like, people have a right to be concerned about external intervention, especially when, you know, we know the history of governments getting involved in kind of violent regime changes and all that. So there's a reason to be deeply concerned about it. And I think the main finding from that study is we found no evidence that that external support was the decisive variable in determining the outcome of these campaigns, that it certainly could help and could boost certain capacities of the movement. We did find one of the most effective ways outside actors could support nonviolent campaigns was by supporting training and technical capacity building. So not surprising that, you know, and we found a very strong correlation between the presence of training of activists and movement leaders in the lead up to the mass protests and successful outcomes of the campaign. So of all the different interventions we looked at, political, economic, financial, like, you know, like tech support, training was most consistently correlated with successful nonviolent campaigns. But it's not an easy, straightforward picture. There's a lot of nuance. That's why in the study, you know, we combine both a very robust large N set of like the empirical part, and then we looked at, now I can't remember how many case studies, this was my part, I feel like we did this a while ago so I can't remember, but I think 7 case studies that looked at like 3 Arab Spring countries, Sudan, Ukraine, Serbia, and a few others. And you know, and I was involved in one of them. So in the US, in the Serbia campaign, for example, and kind of, you know, what happened there with the nonviolent protests becoming eventually surpassed by armed resistance and regime repression. So it's not a clear-cut answer, but like certain forms of transnational solidarity was often correlated with successful campaigns, the provision of training, but it's it's not the case that external actors are responsible or were the driving force behind the success of nonviolent campaigns. So that we weren't able to find any evidence of in the cases. So I think when you hear from the left, oh, the US was responsible for the Serbian Revolution or the Orange Revolution in 2005, or here, be suspicious and ask a lot of questions, because often what that narrative does is it undermines the agency of the people in those countries who are taking huge risks to engage in nonviolent protests and defiance, which ultimately is the most important variable in determining the outcome of campaigns. So look to Iran right now. I was not recently talking about the protests that are now in their second or third month following the death and detention of a young Iranian woman. And this was a conversation during the Q&A about external actors and should the US say nothing? Should people be quiet? And I think there was a lot of resistance to that from the Iranian panelists. They were like, no, people all over the world should be speaking out in support of human rights, in support of the nonviolent activists. And it's like that type of support is powerful, because people knowing that others are looking at their struggle, they've got eyes on. It's other forms of support that, in governmental manipulation and the history of violent regime changes, that are cause for, I think, a lot of concern.
Thank you very much. So Arnd, would you like to ask a question or make a comment, an observation?
Meanwhile, I'll finally.
I have to unmute myself. Remember to
Yes.
unmute. Thank you for that brilliant talk. It raised so many issues that it's like Ellie said, very hard to figure out where to start. But let me start with the comment that you made just now with respect to Iran, which I've been following very closely too. And I think that you're certainly right that having the sense that there's international support for this nonviolent movement in Iran is enormously important. But I think that it's also important to kind of break it down a little bit. And in that regard, I think that one of the things that it seems to me that the Iranian government has as a knee-jerk reaction to any kind of protest is to immediately say, well, this is all orchestrated by the United States and it's part of a regime change operation and so on and so forth. So while I think that international support is very important, I think probably it would be a good idea for the American government to keep its mouth shut on this issue for the time being, and to distance itself, if any, or in any event, not to add any fuel to the accusation that this is a movement that is being supported from the outside by the United States and so on. Let me put that aside for the moment, and I just wanted to say two other things very quickly. One is that I think that the situation in Canada, from the perspective of what you were saying about the rise of authoritarianism, is perhaps not quite as scary as it is in the United States, but it's not that far off. And the reason that I say that is, on the one hand, that in terms of nonviolence, one of the more inspiring movements of nonviolent resistance is the one that was mentioned by Lyn earlier on, by the Wet'suwet'en, that are essentially waging a nonviolent resistance campaign to protect their own lands, and they have plenty of treaties on their side and plenty of public support on their side, but they have been met consistently with a militarized response by the Canadian government and the RCMP in a very extreme way, and that's something that is certainly indicative of the extent to which the Canadian government is still very much willing to, especially when it comes to fossil fuel projects, use extreme measures and authoritarian measures to get their way. The other thing that seems to me to very much enter into this as well is the response on the part of the Ontario government to a strike by educational support workers that are among the most poorly paid workers in Ontario, and that were met immediately with back to work legislation in a rather draconian manner. In that regard, I think that we're very much in a similar kind of a trajectory as the United States. The one place that I find hope, and I think you might be able to address that to some extent, is that it seems to me that this same picture is emerging very much in the context of Western Europe as well, where militarization, and especially a militarized response to the crisis in Ukraine, is having a very hard time finding any opposition, even from progressive forces. That seems to be as much the case in Canada and as much the case in the United States, as recently illustrated by the 30 progressives in the Democratic Party that meekly suggested nonviolent approaches and the exploration of diplomacy as a way of ending the conflict in Ukraine, and were very quickly shut down in this regard. I have the impression that the same kind of dynamic exists within Canada. That Canada has not had a strong progressive voice in favor of a peaceful resolution to conflict in the context of the Ukraine. And that seems to be the case in much of Western Europe as well, with the Green Party in Germany, for example, being among the most hawkish in regard to the crisis in Ukraine. It seems to me that there's a little bit of a different story when we look at the global South, and in particular in Latin America, in parts of Africa, and so on. There seems to be very much of very much more of a creative approach to these kinds of problems, and I wonder whether you have that same impression. Let me leave it at that, and sorry for taking too long.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. Ukraine is, I think, Ukraine is a difficult one, and I imagine for peace groups. I was in touch recently with someone from Pax Christi in Germany who was expressing very similar concerns to yours, and I think, it's a very difficult situation because it's a case where a sovereign country was invaded by a neighboring country that has genocidal intent. When it refers to Ukraine in a certain way as kind of a vassal, you pay attention to that because that is part of Putin's ideology. And Putin, I'm very familiar with Putin's negotiating tactics. I saw how he negotiated on Syria, and he's not the most trustworthy so those who are like, negotiate, give him an off-ramp. You just need to have somewhat of a power analysis too, and a familiarity of what Putin's objectives are and all this. At the same time, of course, it's concerning the weaponization, the militarization. I was mostly concerned when there was the talk of mercenaries going into Ukraine. And, early on after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I was doing writings, presentations on civil resistance options, how civil resistance was being used in Ukraine, in Russia, in Belarus, in the region. And I think that's still investing in that type of work and that type of support is critically important. So I hope people keep putting pressure on their governments to invest more in support for nonviolent organizing, for civil resistance, for being able to communicate against repression. Like, all of those things are critically important. Where I personally started to get uncomfortable was when I was reading the statements of some peace groups, and they were almost verbatim Putin's talking points. And they just seemed a little bit, I don't know what the word is, but it didn't seem to be kind of recognizing all the different power dynamics at play. And that's where I wonder, like, what is the alternative? So for those who are saying negotiate, what will bring Putin to the table now? And also I think to myself, okay, if part of the United States also were invaded and territories were annexed. And again, Crimea was annexed before this recent round of invasion. I don't remember seeing a lot of activity in the peace movement when that happened, which would have been a great moment to be like, no, like this type of aggression is also is unacceptable. So what is the approach, or what approach would you take if you were living in the country? Would it be, yes, let's negotiate so that Russia can keep control of these territories? Like, is that the solution at this point? I don't know. I think it's a very difficult situation, but I am not convinced that Putin will give up territorial ambitions in Ukraine and possibly elsewhere, you know, by denying weapons, by denying. But I share your concern about the over-militarization of the situation. And I think civic groups should be doubling down and insisting that for every dollar spent on military hardware, whatever, governments are committing to this amount for nonviolent solutions, civil resistance, nonviolent organ. I wish that were the demand, because governments may listen to that at this moment. But I know this is probably a bigger conversation about Ukraine, and I'm usually not a fan of giving weaponry. In this case, though, and the reason, because people were asking, well, your research says this about the efficacy of nonviolent resistance compared to armed struggle. The challenge is that we're not looking at an analogous campaign where it's like an internal resistance to a government. We're talking about a military invasion. Now, if we're occupying certain parts of Ukraine, there's a huge role for civilian-based defense, for civil resistance, for that type of work. But just like the military, the attempt to topple Kiev, and it's a little bit tricky to know how negotiations alone, for example, are going to persuade Putin to act differently, unfortunately. But I'm sure a lot of different opinions, I'm sure, on this call about Ukraine.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you, Arnd, and thank you, Maria. At this point, we'd like to give the audience an opportunity for some questions. So if you would like to ask a question, you can use the reaction button to indicate that you'd like to speak, or you can put your question in the chat and I'll read it. Oops. And if I don't see one right away, Ellie, if you could
Yeah. Oh,
go ahead.
If somebody else wants to talk.
Elizabeth, you have put some comments in the chat. Do you want to, you mentioned about BC and the Wet'suwet'en. I hope that people on this call are aware of the RBC campaign, because the RBC is funding the CGL pipeline, and there just was a day of action across the country on Saturday. So a lot of actions happening, and anything folks can do to raise that protest is a support to Wet'suwet'en. Okay, I'm seeing Maria's hand and then Richard. So go ahead, Maria.
Yes, thank you so much for all your comments, Maria. I could listen to you all day. It's great. You pack a lot of punch into a short amount of time. And forgive me if I'm not quite so succinct. I was interested in what you said about when you discussed the attributes of successful nonviolent resistant movements, and that training in nonviolence was correlated very highly with success. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about the kinds of nonviolent trainings that perhaps you're aware of as being particularly effective.
Sure. And let me just, while I've got it here in the chat, just a link. And I would just also note on Ukraine, if it's of interest, the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame hosted a really excellent webinar on nonviolent approaches. This was, again, earlier in the conflict after the Russian invasion, but it had, you know, strong Ukrainian perspectives. Myself, someone from Nonviolence International, Lisa Shirk, who some of you may know, is a big author and thinker in the peacebuilding field. It was really good. If I can find the link to that webinar, I'll share it as well, but it may just open up ideas for things that can be done and are happening, because sometimes you get the impression in the media that there is no nonviolent anything going on. There never has been civil resistance, and that's simply not true. So I think like countering that narrative is important. But in terms of training, so there are, you know, lots of different or a number of different organizations that provide nonviolent action trainings. So, they range from the Canvas organization, the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action Strategies, based in Belgrade, that's done trainings with activists in Sudan and certainly in Central and Eastern Europe and other places, very much grounded in kind of Sharpian nonviolent action, civil resistance. So Canvas is one. The International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, ICNC, also does online trainings, and certainly pre-pandemic was doing a lot of in-person trainings with activists in different countries around the world. Then you have in different regions, like in Africa, for example, there's the African Coaches Network. So this is a network of African movement leaders from East and West Africa that are very well versed in movement strategy and nonviolent action and peace building, who have been leading activist trainings in different parts of the African continent. There's Solidarity Uganda, which does a lot of work in East Africa. There's the organization RISE, RHIZE, does a lot of movement support, mentorship, and the like. So there are a number of groups that are today involved in this type of training. And I'm in Canada, I would imagine there must be some, but I'm less familiar with the Canadian kind of training scene. But in the US, there are probably 15 other organizations that are doing work in nonviolent action training as well.
Good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Richard next, and then David will be after that.
Thanks, Maria. You threw out many interesting ideas, but I think one of the fundamental ones that you brought to us was this idea that the most powerful antidote to authoritarian tendencies is broad-based nonviolent groups or coalitions. And I think that many of us would agree with that, but also go on to say that, well, how do we do it? I mean, it's right. And in the US, there certainly has been some movement towards the coalescence of a coalition. But the general problem is, of course, one of silos, as we all know, that, you have the climate activists, one silo, and peace activists, another, and racial equality groups, and sexual orientation rights and group, all of whom share certain basic assumptions, but they have their own agenda. And of course, there isn't the real issue, the real problem of how you bring together this coalition, how you bring together the cacophony of voices into a chorus, let's say, where people are really, in a sense, singing the same song. I mean, if that could be done, then it would be an enormously powerful movement against authoritarianism, because an aspirant authoritarian would know that at least in every major city in the United States, or in Canada for that matter, there was an organized movement that would respond to any attempt to overthrow government, basically, to break the rules of the game or in a flagrant manner. So, there's been a lot of work done on this, on how you integrate, create an intersectoral alliance involving racial justice groups, indigenous rights groups, as well as the climate activists, the peace activists, human rights groups in general, religious groups. I guess that what I'm suggesting, I'm not expecting to be able to resolve this puzzle, but what do we know about the best ways to bring about this intersectoral popular movement that would be a real manifestation of people power and a major way of dissuading authoritarians?
Yeah, no, that's the $1 million question, I think. And I think when I used to talk with activists from different kind of major movements around the world, I would kind of ask them, how did it start? Like, how many of you were there? And often it would be like between 10 and 15 like-minded people who came together, were sort of the core decision makers. And then, a movement would expand, and there would be different campaigns to recruit different members and participants. I remember the story from the Otpor movement in Serbia, the 2000 pro-democracy movement. And you had this like group of like 10 or 12 young people that formed the Otpor resistance movement that later set up branches all across the country. And like their initial target groups for recruitment into the movement were retired people and high school students. Retired people have time to do a lot of things that a movement needs. High school students like also have energy, youth, they want to be cool and like with the older. So there was like very specific like reasons for the groups that they targeted and why. And I think they also, and we had actually an event on training and facilitation for cross-sector movements. I'll find the link to that as well. This was a Horizons Project webinar a few weeks ago. And so the webinar featured 4 trainers. So Ivan Marovic from ICNC and formerly from the Otpor movement, someone from the Momentum training tradition in the US, someone from the Leading Change Network, so Marshall Gantz, who's a prominent kind of organizer, movement builder in the US. And like they were talking about different models of training, because if you do training well, it's a recruitment mechanism. So you bring people into a movement by developing internal training modalities. And so like normally you would think that the way to go about it is recruit, train, act. And Ivan during that webinar said, no, our approach as Otpor to grow our movement was act, train, or it's like basically the inverse of what you would think. Because it's like take people who are involved in actions and then recruit them, train them, get them out during. So they had a whole model for like recruiting people, training them, retaining them, you know, advancing their leadership. And I think that's such a key part of like building and expanding movements. And movements take different structures. So like, you know, there's often this debate about centralized movements or like, you know, the values, the advantages and disadvantages of very decentralized movements. Most effective movements have some combination of like centralized decision making and decentralized tactics and activities. But like, you know, that's where starting with a power map. So like good analysis that leads to recruitment, like who's in the key pillars that are holding up an authoritarian or otherwise oppressive system? Who are the pillars? Like, where are there like variations? Like, where are there different loyalties? And then how do we think about the full range of tactics to like recruit or pressure people from within those pillars? So like the starting point of a power analysis, spectrum of allies, pillars of support can help lead to movement decisions about who to bring in, how, through what means, that kind of thing. Hopefully that's a start to the answer.
That's great, Maria. And the links to those webinars, if you can find
okay,
them, much
I'm on
appreciated.
it. I am on it.
You're on it. Okay, so David is next. And Maria, is your hand still up from before? Yes. Okay, so we only have Maria for another 6 minutes. She has to go at 6. We can stay on for a few more minutes, another 5 minutes to talk a bit about the Nonviolence Working Group. For anyone that's interested in that, please stay on for a few minutes, but we will lose Maria in about 6 minutes or so. And sorry, we had a question from David Burman. You're next. Go ahead.
Okay, so this is great. Now I have one very great question, at least that disturbed me mightily. That was last February when we had this truckers convoy that, from what I can tell, they co-opted and used a lot of the language of nonviolent resistance against what they perceived as an authoritarian, draconian mask mandate for truckers crossing the border. People that I love and care for that are really caring, far from what I consider to be right wing. And yet they were supporting, especially, I think, the white spirituals, that they took on this language of nonviolent resistance. They say, well, but it's a street party. Look, they're having so much fun. And tried to overthrow the government, at least, you know, in words. But they were using, they just co-opted the playbook of nonviolent resistance and yet they were clearly white supremacists, although they co-opted a few indigenous people and Black people into it. So I just wonder if you can comment on how do you counteract this kind of cooptation of resistance?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, you know, the thing about nonviolent resistance, of course, is that it can be used for good and for bad, right? Like all the tactics. I mean, the KKK was very good at boycotts and strikes and marches and vigils. And so it's like, you know, the tactics can be used by anyone. It's like, what is the movement for? Who's included? What are the goals? What are the values underpinning the movement, and like, are we in agreement about those values, kind of thing? So starting at the level of like, who's included, who's not included, and what is this movement for, I think is maybe one way to get at it, because and it's happening in the US as well. I think even Bolsonaro, am I mistaken? I haven't been following Brazil super closely, but I believe Bolsonaro has just called for a major civil resistance campaign in Brazil. So again, it's a tool that's readily available for all, just like negotiations can be used for good and for evil. I know a lot of negotiations that were used to like uphold very oppressive power structures. And so just because they were negotiations and nonviolent doesn't mean they were like good, kind of thing. So like starting at the level of values, norms, and like what we're for and like what they're for, I think is one way. And then like kind of outpowering them through your own nonviolent organizing. It's like, this is what they stand for. That's their tactics. Like, this is what we stand for. And this is who's participating in our movement, our campaign, I think is another way to think about it.
Because they were successful at drawing a much more extreme response from the government, which, you know, played into the whole freedom from oppression scenario.
And that was a question earlier, by the way, that I don't think I addressed. So someone else mentioned the militarization and the kind of violence from the regime. And that's a key point. So one thing worth bearing in mind that I think in the data set underpinning why civil resistance works, I think something like 90+% of the campaigns faced regime or paramilitary violence. So violence is the norm in nonviolent campaigns. And then it's like, is the movement prepared, organized, disciplined, trained to know how to make violence backfire? And there's a whole art. Some of you may know Brian Martin. He's an Australian sociologist. He also is a prolific nonviolent action author. He's written books on how to make political violence backfire, Brian Martin. And so he's another one who has a lot of ideas on like how to make, you know, various state violence, paramilitary, non-state actor violence, turn against the perpetrators, essentially. Because if you don't do it right, violence against a movement can end up undermining the movement. And so there's actually an art and a science to making violence backfire, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of strategic considerations, and we're just getting a taste of it in this session with you today, for which we're very grateful. And I think there's a lot more that we can be studying there. As I said, I'd like to invite folks to stay on to learn a little bit more. We have a couple of announcements of events coming up. We will lose Maria in about a minute, so I don't know if you have any closing remarks you'd like to offer.
No, well, it's great just to connect with you all and to be in conversation with like-mindeds and people who are facing, you know, maybe it's not the same extreme level of kind of far-right extremism and authoritarianism in Canada as it is in the US. In the US, it's deeply concerning, but as you all seem to say, it's not that far away, kind of thing. So thinking about how we can strengthen our collective efforts, our organizing, our coalition building, and frankly, our learning across borders, I think is well worth the investment. So thanks, thanks for the invitation to be with you all, and I hope we can stay in touch.
Yes, I think we can